Well, welcome everybody, and we're still bringing people into this session. It is, I'd like to put a marker, November 13th, um, 2 days after Veterans Day in the US, and 2 days after we mark the end of World War One. And this is in 2025. This is our course on international crisis management. What an honor to have Professor Michael Clarke with us today, who knows, I think, more than anybody about the shifting, evolving plans of Europe in its wish to be helpful to Ukraine while NATO is in fits and starts. The United States, I'm just going to say it, is an unreliable ally. I don't mean a bad ally, but you just never know what's coming next from the US. And let me just quote from today. Thanks, by the way, to Dennis Dimitrov. Thank you so much. Oh, Dennis, there you are. I see your image there.
Yeah.
This is your doing, Dennis. Thank you so much.
Uh,
Uh,
yeah. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Professor Clark, for coming. And it's great to have you. And yeah, thank you for joining.
Okay, good, good. I see you're in a war room, Dennis. You're planning the next offensive. Well, today, let me just, I won't spend much time on this. Today, Washington Post, page 11. First of all, something of a corruption incident or scandal, you might say, in Ukraine with the resignation of two key members of the cabinet. Um, that would be energy and justice. This is a big deal. Um, the previous image before the invasion that Ukraine had in the West was one where there was always a little bit of corruption scandal beneath the surface. It seems that in the last couple of days, this has very much come to the surface, and there may be Ukrainians on this call who might have light to shed. I know nothing except that two of the principal cabinet members were forced to resign. More relevantly for today's session, on the same page, European defense plans face logistic and political hurdles. Well, that's not news, is it, Professor Clarke?
Huh.
But there are all sorts of different configurations. There's the Joint Expeditionary Force, there's the Coalition of the Willing. It seems as if the Nordic countries and Great Britain and Poland and the Baltics seem to be a little bit more involved than others. You are a professor at King's College London and University of Exeter, and you're the founder of the Center for Defense Studies. What could be more relevant for us today than to get all the questions answered? And we will settle only for the perfect answers. We look to you for that. Professor Clarke, great to have you. And please take the microphone and let us know what we need to know.
Dan, thank you very much. No, it's very good to be with you today and to share this with 63 participants. Goodness.
And growing and growing.
And growing. Very good.
You
Excellent.
should you
Thank you.
should know that some of these connections are with multiple people, so the
Yeah.
numbers are greater than the line. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you. No,
Yeah.
it's very nice to be with you in such an international context as this. And so what I thought I would do is just set a very broad scene to stimulate your thinking and questions, maybe, or structure it a little bit in terms of what I worry about. And then I'll answer whatever questions I can after maybe about 20 minutes. So
Thank you.
let me just talk first of all about the broad outlines of European security, and then about the Ukraine war and where I think we are with the war. As far as the broad outlines of European security goes, I mean, we know that it's almost a Shakespearean trajectory from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, 1991. The Soviet Union collapses almost overnight. It ceased to exist. And it was astonishing, and it gave us what many have referred to as the holiday from history, because it gave a sense that this was a new era, and it felt like a new era in the Gulf War of '91, and then the idea of the United States as sole remaining superpower. I won't go through all of that, but that began to pall, and we should have taken more note of it in 2007, 2008. We talked about enlarging NATO, which was the right thing to do on political grounds, but we didn't think through the strategic effects that that might have. And Vladimir Putin gave very, very clear warnings of the way he thought about this at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And there we were in 2008, more or less ignoring what he said. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Don't worry about it. We'll convince the Russians that this is all part of a greater European security. And then the big sort of tipping points were really, I think, between 2014 and 2016, because in 2014, not only did we have the Russian takeover of Crimea and the beginning of the invasion of the Donbass, so 2 wars in between March and August, September that year, which created the crisis of 2014, which led to Russia being the most sanctioned country in the world. But it was actually overshadowed in most strategic thinking in the West by the crisis in Syria and the worry about chemical weapons use in Syria. And the West, of course, famously established red lines and then didn't back them up. And once we went along with that, there were more than 200 uses of chemical weapons in Syria, all pretty well documented. So we sold the pass on the use of chemical weapons, and indeed we've seen that occur. We've seen chemical agents, nerve agents, being used extensively in Ukraine. And then the other issue of that in that period, 2014 to 2016, was Islamic State. And the sort of crisis across the Levant, which seemed to absorb everyone's attention. But in reality, of course, what was happening in Europe was far more important. And then 2016, the first Trump administration began to send shivers through NATO for reasons that we don't need to go into. I mean, we don't need to repeat that President Trump took a really different view to most of his predecessors, not on the issue of burden sharing. He said exactly what they've been saying for years, but this time he was prepared to be very precipitate in enforcing his will. He didn't like NATO as an organization. He doesn't like multinational organizations anyway. I mean, like Russia and China, the United States under President Trump would much prefer to deal bilaterally, because that's where the sheer weight of the superpower can count. Whereas in a multilateral context, then the edges get knocked off, and he's just not good at it. A, he doesn't like it, and B, he's not very good in multinational and multilateral negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
So that changed in 2016. But the view then, right through to 2022, and the view I took, which I think sensibly enough everybody else took, was that Russia was a nuisance. It was a real nuisance, but it would not be a strategic issue for Europe unless we allowed it to be. If we mishandled it, it might become strategically very important. But it was just a nuisance, and it had been a very aggressive nuisance in 2014, and that was reprehensible. But somehow we thought that this was external to our fundamental security. So the invasion of Ukraine, 24th of February 2024, 2022, 24th of February 2022, we all know what we were doing and where we were when we heard about it. That was a Rubicon, and that's where we are. There is no way back for Russia now, and because of that, there's no way back for European security. We are in a completely different field now, and it's taken some time for our decision makers really to accept that reality. Rhetorically, they accepted it quite quickly, but actually only now are they beginning to think through the implications of that. Now, what does that mean in terms of European security? I think 3 big issues here, just to lay them out. One is that Russia has showed, by crossing the Rubicon, Russia has given up on peaceful coexistence. And what you see this all the time in Russian commentary. They say, look, peaceful coexistence never did us any good. It was just peaceful coexistence allowed us to lose the Cold War. We peacefully coexisted and they beat us with their consumerism. And peaceful coexistence is a way for them to keep us out of things that we have a right to be involved in. Peaceful coexistence is what they tell us when they want us to keep quiet. And I mean, President Putin made the point. He said containment, containment for us in the West. We think containment goes back to 1946, 1947, Harriman and Kennan, and the famous article in July 1947's Foreign Affairs. I remember it was almost the first thing I read as a young student, is the X article on containment. So for us, containment is a very specific intellectual and political mantra. It was a doctrine. It was very successful. Putin says containment goes back to the 18th century. The West has always had a policy of containment. They only started to name it in the Cold War, but they've always contained Russian power because they fear us, because they will not allow us to express our historic destiny. That's the way he sees these things. So point number one in terms of European security is that the Russians have given up on peaceful coexistence. And they say that, I mean, Medvedev says this very clearly, so does people like Karaganov. Do you know, I bought Karaganov his first laptop computer at King's College. I used to know him reasonably well. And so did my great friend Lawrence Friedman, who we were just speaking about down offline. And Karaganov did some work for us, and he couldn't get a laptop computer in Russia at the time. So I bought him a laptop computer when he was in London. Anyway, he's gone over to the dark side now. And Karaganov and Medvedev, they say that the West believes in peace through strength. We don't believe in that. We believe in peace through fear because it works. You know, we want our neighbors to fear us because then we feel safe. If our neighbors are strong, we don't believe in stabilization in that respect because that's peaceful coexistence, which means that we lose. And that's the current view. So peace through fear, no peaceful coexistence. The second thing that's the second big geopolitical change for Europe, of course, is the United States. And you know, none of us in Europe, we don't know where the US is going. And as Dan said, you know, the US is now, it's gone from being the indispensable ally to the insufferable ally. That's what Corey Shack says.
Touche,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Professor. Yes.
Insufferable ally. But the point is that you know, NATO has been through any number of crises in the past, and it always did come together because we said, look, there's a commonality of values, and we see the geopolitical situation in the same way. You know, ultimately, the West Europeans and the United States interpret the world in more or less the same way, and so we always patched up our differences on that basis. And so the question marks now are, does the United States still share the liberal democratic values that in the way we express them in Europe? And the answer seems to be no, that this sort of Christian nationalism seems now to take precedence over liberal democratic institutionalism, which is what we hold on to in our European version of democracy. And so the values may not be the same, question mark. And then more obviously than that the United States does not share the same geopolitical perspective on the rest of the world as the Europeans. So for the Europeans, we say the Ukraine war is a fundamental crisis of world politics. And the Trump administration says, no, it isn't. It's a European problem. You deal with it. It's a regional war. It's your problem. You know, we have to worry about Taiwan and China. And of course, the Europeans come back, and I say this all the time. You say, if Putin prevails in Ukraine, your Taiwan problem will be a great deal worse, a great deal harder. They're all of a piece in ways that we could talk about for the rest of the day. But that's not the way the White House sees it. They say it's either or. I look at Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon. He's fixated on directing resources towards the China problem, as he sees it, as if the European issue was just a distraction, as opposed to being, from our point of view, intrinsically part of the challenge to the Western liberal rules-based international order, the free trade, where was that? You know, the free trading liberal order. So the difference in values, question mark, difference in geopolitical perspectives, very clear as the two types of cement that always held NATO together. And so if there's no way back for Europe in terms of our relations with Russia, I suspect there's no way back in our transatlantic relations either. And whatever transatlantic relationships emerge in the next, say, 10 to 15 years, they will be different to the ones of the past. They won't necessarily have disappeared, but they will be different, is my view. And then the third big element in all of this, in European politics, is coming back to NATO itself, the difference between the northern agenda and the southern agenda. As NATO, you know, when NATO started at 12, then it went to 15, then 16. And at that level, NATO was a very impressive military organization of effectively Western and Northwestern Europe. That's really what it was like. But now NATO is twice that size, from 16 to 32. And it is a very extensive organization. And the countries that have added something to NATO's security in the enlargement are Poland, Finland, and Sweden. Most of the other countries to whom NATO has enlarged have not actually added very much to security. What they've done is added commitments that NATO is facing. And so, Montenegro has added its military might to the alliance, and North Macedonia has added its military might to the alliance. That's thanks a lot. Yeah. So there's two more territories we've got to worry about without any increase in anything other than geopolitical advantage. So NATO, I would argue, is militarily not twice as strong as it was when it was 16. It's probably half as strong as it was when it was at 16. So NATO has got lots of issues, and one of the dynamics in NATO that I've seen over my professional life is this increasing difference between the agenda of the northern members and the agenda of the southern members. That was always there, of course it was, and you can see it's perfectly understandable. The northern countries worry a lot more about Russia, because if you're in Scandinavia, you certainly do. If you're northwestern Europe, if you're an Atlantic power like Great Britain is, then of course you think much more that Russia is both the structural as well as the immediate threat. But in southern Europe, the concern is national cohesion, immigration, terrorism, the fallout from Middle Eastern conflicts, the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a different set of issues. And so countries like, let's say, going from the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the Balkan states, to Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, all of those states and the states in the Balkans themselves, the Western Balkans, for them, security is a different set of problems. And this difference between the northern and southern agendas, I think, has become fairly acute, because at 32, it's very difficult to get consensus in NATO, or at 27, it's very difficult to get consensus in the European Union with this difference of perspective. And so increasingly, both the EU and NATO are beginning now to work in more, not multilateral alliance ways, but minilateral ways, as the phrase is. And that's one of the things that the Joint Expeditionary Force is really all about. And we talk about that in questions. It's 10 nations. Poland is not a member, but it wouldn't be hard to imagine it becoming a member. I mean, the Baltics worry about that a bit because Poland is so much bigger. But that would make sense. Canada might well think in terms of becoming a GEF member, since Iceland is a member as well. And that would be logical from Canada's point of view for all sorts of reasons. And of course, if Germany became a member of the grouping, that would add a lot to it. France is in a different and difficult position, because France is both a northern and a southern member of NATO. It's got an Atlantic coast to worry about and a Mediterranean coast, and is fundamentally important to Western defence in all sorts of other ways. So France, I don't think you would ever expect to have a really integrative relationship with the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. But I could imagine a much closer relationship, or if not membership, for Poland, for Canada, and some sort of integrative arrangement for Germany that might evolve and develop. And then the JEF it's those countries, all of which have reached more than 2% of their GDP on defence. They've all put more into physical military aid to Ukraine than anyone else. They're all the most tough-minded members of NATO. And in a way, I think NATO is probably going to evolve. And this is the structural issue I'm getting at. NATO won't go out of business, but I think it will evolve into an organization that has a different transatlantic relationship with Washington, and which has a sort of a northern core and a southern periphery in military terms. That's where I think NATO is going. And in a way, it'll settle on something that looks a bit like the original 12, in that sort of concern with the North Atlantic and Northwestern Europe. That's where I think it's going. And then finally, let me just say a few things about the Ukraine war itself as it exists in this week of November. Immediately, I think Pokrovsk is now gone. I think the Ukrainians are withdrawing from Pokrovsk. The 155th Mech Brigade, I think, was pulled out. The 68th Jaeger Brigade, I think, had to be pulled out. Both of them very badly mauled. The special forces that are in there are there not to fight it, but to hold open the escape route, which is only about 3 kilometers wide at the moment to the north. And I think the Ukrainians will find themselves digging in at Dobropilya, which is still defensible. Minorad is not. They'll lose that with Pokrovsk, but they'll dig in at Dobropilia. And then the question becomes, do the Russians go for Pavlograd, which is towards Dnipropetrovsk, which I don't think they will, but they might, or they might more likely go towards Kostiantynivka and Druskivka, to get behind the fortress cities, in order to try to get the Donbass. They won't do that, I think, soon. Always when the Russians achieve one of these Pyrrhic victories, they pause for a long time because they don't have the ability to keep going or to create the momentum. So I think Pokrovsk goes the way of Avdiivka. Say again, it's strategically important. Bakhmut wasn't really. It was always entirely symbolic. But Avdiivka was symbolic and important. Pokrovsk is symbolic and important. And I think that we're looking now at again the Russians having some sense that they could probably take the rest of the Donbass in a spring offensive on the other side of the winter. And I think the Ukrainians are thinking in those terms themselves, as that being that their next task. In more general terms, I think we've got to realize that in putting the war into perspective, the Russians are into their third different army now. They've gone through three armies in this war, which is not to say that their first army were all killed and wounded, but the first army was broken up effectively by its failures and was replaced by a second army. And that second army has more or less failed and is now being replaced by a third army of about 750,000 men operating in Ukraine. So they're onto their third army. And their third army is the least effective. Although they're winning, they are the least militarily effective army that they've fielded, because they can't innovate anything more than at the tactical level. Now, they are pulling some troops out of their conscription and recruitment procedures into a strategic reserve for next year, and we'll see what that brings. But at the moment, because they're trying to attack everywhere all at once, all of their new troops have gone straight to the front, and they have therefore no ability to innovate. So they're just doing more of the same, even though there's some inventiveness at the front, as there always is. It's not strategically innovative at all. So they're into the third army. The Ukrainians are into their second army, and again, they're on the back foot and they're short of manpower. But the whole war has gone through three phases as well. So the first war was a war of invasion, which the Ukrainians did extremely well in dynamic defense to frustrate. The second war was a more conventional European war it was a sort of 20th century style European war. And starting in late 2023, early 2024, the third war began to take shape, and we're in the middle of it now. And that is this very hard to characterize war, where drones have substituted for artillery shells, even though artillery shells are still being used at a rate of, well, the Russians about 10,000 a day, the Ukrainians about half of that. But drones are like an artillery shell that can follow you into a dugout. Drones are an artillery shell that can hang around until it sees where you are. And so whereas troops would take their chances against artillery and just dig in, against drones, it's caused real problems. So not much is moving on the battlefield at the moment. Very few vehicles are moving because they get spotted and they get taken out. And so what we're dealing with is a war that is hybrid in so many ways. It goes from muddy trenches to space and the Starlink satellite system. It goes from the need for high numbers of dismounted troops, literally making advances in twos and threes, on scooters, on motorbikes, and then holding a position until a drone can supply the troops with ammunition and food and water, or not, as the case may be. So we're trying to recharacterize the nature of warfare. It's not a particular surprise, but the way it's happened so quickly, I think, is. I remember sitting in briefings in the British Staff College at least 5 years ago now, looking at the future of warfare. And one of the things that we said then, he said that the future battlefield may seem to be surprisingly empty for long periods, because the battle will be being fought in the rear areas. It's the deep battle. It's the deep fires that each side inflict on each other. And at a very late stage, suddenly the battlefield will be full of troops when something is cracked in the deep battle. And then this relatively quiet area that is actually being fought over suddenly becomes very crowded. And I think we're seeing the rapid advance towards that type of warfare now in Ukraine. So we're in a third sort of warfare. And if we just look at it in terms of the domains, sea, air, and ground, at sea, the Ukrainians have established some real advantages. They've got space in the western part of the Black Sea. They've chased the Russians out of Sevastopol towards towards their base in Russia, in Novorossiysk. And even the Russians are having to build another base in Abkhazia, in Georgia, territory that they don't own. They're there illegally, but nevertheless, they're building a new naval base there. And so the Russians have been chased out of the western part of the Black Sea by a country with no navy, which again tells us something about maritime operations. And most importantly, the Ukrainians are able now to get their trade through the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, into the Mediterranean, more or less back to pre-war levels. And that's quite a strategic victory. And they might be able to build on that sort of victory by putting the Russians under even more pressure in other parts of the Black Sea as time goes on. That's one domain. The second domain is the air. And this is the air war. By this, I mean, the Russian attempt to completely hobble the energy infrastructure of Ukraine over the winter. And they will have more destructive power to do that this year than ever before. I think the Ukrainians will get through it because they've found different ways of generating power, but it will be harder for them than ever before. But on the other side of that, the Ukrainians have caused the Russians significant problems in their refining industries, and they are now having an effect on the Russian economy with their attacks, very specific attacks on Russia's refineries. Now, this is not going to win the war for Ukraine, but it actually adds to the costs of the war for the Kremlin. And it gets noticed in Moscow and Petersburg, where not many people are serving compared to anywhere else, like in Buryatia or anywhere like that. It gets noticed that there are problems of petrol, that airports are closed at regular intervals because of Ukrainian drone attacks, that flights around Russia are constantly disrupted by it. So it actually gives a sense that the Ukrainians are able to bring the costs of the war at some level home to the Russian population. But then on the ground, what we're looking at is this slow, expensive advance of Russian troops. And ultimately, I think if nothing else changes, either politically or militarily, then I'm guessing that this time next year, the Russians will be in control of the rest of the Donbass, and that they will then control about 22-23% of Ukrainian territory. And the Ukrainians will never give that up legally, nor should they. But they may well feel that de facto they have to accept that in some sort of ceasefire, maybe around about this time next year, and live with it. And that's, again, there's lots of cases in international history where that is the case. The Japanese lost the two southernmost islands, the Kuril Islands, and they've never given it to Russia in 1945. They've never given up claim to it. So, if the Russian Federation collapses in the fullness of time, then undoubtedly Japan will say, how about our two islands that have been sitting there for the last 130 years or whatever, 170 years, whatever it might be. So there's no reason why the Ukrainians need to give up their legal claim to Crimea and to the Donbass and so on. But they may well de facto have to settle for that in concluding what I would take to be an unstable ceasefire that we may see around about this time next year. And my final point is that what is happening in Ukraine is of global importance. It's more important than what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East, even though that is very important to the Middle East. It's more important than what is happening in Sudan, even though the misery in Sudan and Darfur and South Sudan as well now is in human terms worse than Ukraine. It's more important than that. And the reason is because the rest of the world is standing back to see what happens. And I go back to the 3rd of March 2022, a couple of weeks after the Russian invasion, a very strong resolution went through the General Assembly. And it was a really strong resolution saying that this Russian invasion is completely unacceptable, and we demand that it be reversed immediately. That was a very strongly worded resolution. And the numbers on that were 144 nations voted for that resolution. 5 voted against it, like Russia and Belarus, and I think Syria and was it Yemen, I think, and
Um,
can't remember the fifth one.
yes.
Can't remember. I've forgotten now.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
5 voted against it.
Yes, I.
141 to 5, but 30,
Oh,
sorry, 35.
Eritrea. It was
35.
Eritrea, I think. Yeah.
Eritrea, that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Eritrea. I knew it was very eccentric. Yeah.
Yeah.
So 5 voted against and 35 abstained. So the result was 144 condemned it and 40 didn't condemn it. Now that sounds pretty decisive, and those numbers didn't change in subsequent UN General Assembly resolutions. There were 2 or 3 similar ones over the next year. But those 40 who didn't condemn it included more than half the world's population. So China, India, important countries like Nigeria, South Africa. And so it was clear from the very beginning that although the Western powers, we were outraged by what happened in 2022, we were um, completely condemnatory by this outrageous, unprovoked aggression by Russia. Most of the rest of the world was standing back to see what happens. And so this war is not about who is right, it's about who will prevail. That's the whole point, who will prevail. Just like the Second World War, there were 3 Allied powers in 1939. There were 55 Allied powers in 1945, as it became clear after 1942 who would prevail. And that's the point. If the West cannot be seen to prevail, then the world will make up its mind accordingly and adjust to the new realities of the great dictatorships being the powers that are going to make the political weather for everybody else. And for that reason, this war is not about any exist, as Dan said, it's not about corruption in Ukraine. Even if Ukraine were totally corrupt, which it isn't, but even if Ukraine were totally corrupt, this war would still be worth fighting for the more fundamental reasons. And even if Ukraine finds it difficult to get onto the path of development and democracy, this war would be worth fighting for other reasons. This war is worth fighting or worth engaging in because it's the crucible in a fundamental struggle between a system of politics that we've had that's grown up for 250 to 300 years and one that is now is attempted to be replaced very rapidly and violently by dictators and autocrats. And for that reason, it matters. So,
Professor Clarke, thank you for this cold shower. You've given us a lot of accuracy and a certain degree of discomfort and pain. Pokrovsk, the media in the U.S. seem to believe that Pokrovsk really is not a strategic. It's more of a symbolic thing, which is apparently why the Ukrainian forces have been willing to take great sacrifices there. Maybe not for a strategic advantage, but for it's a question of perception. I don't know if you see it that way. Let me put out a number of reactions, and then I do want to ask Ukrainians and others to come in here. This is a very complete and accurate view of where we are, and thank you for let's call it realism, Professor. As you've said, there's a difference between what we want and what we're likely to get. I'd like to, as an American, I'd like to just say, when you say the U.S. does not have the same perspective as the NATO countries, I would only say that it's the Trump administration, perhaps more than the American people, but that's that may be.
No, I take that absolutely. I'm saying that the current administration has it, and whether this will last 4 years or 12 years will be, we'll see.
Understood, and we don't know. We know things will always change, correct? I mean, everything that you've just told us is on the basis of that supposition. Last week, we talked about George F. Kennan. You mentioned the X article. I just wanted the people listening to note that Professor Clarke has mentioned the X article and its companion piece, sort of the opposite, which was the NSC 68, penned by Paul Nitze. I've put in the Google Classroom a suggestion of an exercise to people very generally. How did these two documents differ? They were opposites, actually, the X article and the NSC 68. And containment, which was a word used by Kennan, but as far as I can see, Professor, In his 5,000 word cable, he used the word only once.
Yeah,
And
that's
it was,
right.
and it was basically, he never intended it to be the basis of a strategy,
Mm.
but it did become so because
Yep,
people, each person, Truman and Nitze and others saw it in their own way, later enraging Kennan, but that's a tangent. Let me say, going back to the first points that you made, um, the so-called core effects, or the ground reason which
Mm.
Putin keeps referring to, within that is the supposition that James Baker promised Vladimir Putin that there would be
Yeah.
no eastward expansion. That is a lie.
Absolutely.
We
Yeah,
know that
absolutely.
James Baker never said such a thing. He might have said something um, hypothetical, like what if. He may have said something like that.
That's right. And then he went to bed. It was the last thing he said before he went to bed
Okay.
to Gorbachev. And then Gorbachev took
Gorbachev,
it back.
sorry, I
Yeah.
meant Gorbachev.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the last thing that Baker said before he retired for the night, just as a sort of a parting thought.
yeah,
And it was reported back as if it was an offer. And then it became somehow a clear documentary commitment in Russian mythology.
yes.
Anyway,
Which is a lie, and which is
yeah,
being
yeah,
perpetuated very much by Putin
yeah,
in
yeah,
his
yeah.
confusion of lies. Um, and again, we had the chance to talk to Marvin Kalb a couple of weeks ago, whose latest book, Another Russia, contrasts the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Russian
Mm,
Federation that we have now. Completely different. Um, the Soviets in the early and mid periods of the Cold War understood mutually assured
mm.
destruction. Putin seems to have abandoned that. So I think we can say the Russian Federation really is not a simple continuation of the Soviet Union. You didn't mention, well, you implied that Romania, as a sort of a somewhat southern country, may have less equity. I do
Mm,
want to give
yeah,
credit to Romania for
yeah,
doing
yeah.
punching above its weight, I think, in this regard, and even tiny Moldova, which has been very supportive. A brief plug, everybody. The very new Moldovan ambassador to the U.S., um, Vladislav Kulminsky, will talk to you in Ukrainian language next Wednesday. So those who speak Ukrainian, this is a brilliant ambassador from a tiny country, um, which is it's not strategically important, but there it is, your Western neighbor, Ukraine, and they're very much in favor of you. And Professor Clarke talks about the importance of maintaining a value system. Moldova is very much a part of that.
Mm.
Now, de facto and de jure. If I say North Korea, South Korea, what is your reaction, Professor? When you've implied that maybe the Donbass may be gone, that the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian
Mm.
people, the Ukrainian government would never accept this in principle, but maybe in practice they may be obliged to do so. Do I understand that that's
Yeah.
the way you see it?
Yes, I think that's probably where we're heading. And I think that's where Kiev thinks we might be heading, given that it can't sustain this war forever, or even for, I wouldn't say too much longer, but I mean, it can't sustain it as long as Putin is prepared to sustain it. So they have to think in terms of some sort of basis of a deal. I mean, it's very similar. It's not just, as you say, it's like North and South Korea. It's also like Northern Cyprus. I mean, 1974, Northern Cyprus is only recognized by Turkey. No other country, not even Russia, has recognized Northern Cyprus. But there it is. It's been there since 1974. At some point, the Republic of Cyprus will try to get it back at some point, but not yet.
Did I dream this? Is Cyprus not a member of the EU?
Yes,
Um,
Cyprus is. Yeah, yeah.
isn't that crazy? A
Yes, yeah,
country not even, or an entity not even recognized by some of the major powers.
yeah.
And finally, from me, you mentioned the 35 abstentions in soon after the invasion. Most of these, if not all, were African countries, and it's interesting to just for a moment see things from their point of view. They believe that they've been excluded from the contests of the North. They were drawn into World War II. They believe this really wasn't their struggle, and
That's right. Yeah,
I think their attitude is a pox on both your houses. You've
exactly
both
right.
been
Yeah,
abusive to us,
yeah.
and I'm very concerned about the future of African voting in UNGA because I think they are being peeled off through bribes and intimidation from the Russian Federation. I think if there are future votes, we probably can look to even less support for
Correct.
condemning.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure
conviction.
that's true. It was a great. I think it was quite a shock to Western policymakers
Yes.
how negative most of the African countries were. And I heard a couple of African journalists said to me, they said, from our point of view, this is a war between autocrats and hypocrites. I mean, what do we care who wins it?
Um,
Who cares?
Well, there is their genuine and understandable indifference. I sense that under the surface, there may be bribes and intimidation that we're
Indeed.
not
Yeah.
seeing.
Yeah.
Our permanent representative, Linda Thomas Greenfield, an African American who is the last person in the world who could be seen as a colonial mentality, was accused by Africans of being colonialist. It was a funny moment, and poor Linda Thomas Greenfield didn't know quite what to make of it.
Yeah.
Tatiana Mikolajchuk, Professor, can you see the chat? If not, I'll read it to you.
Yeah. I can't see
Tatiana
it.
Mikolajchuk, writing, I think, from Malta, of all places.
Oh, right.
What
Okay.
strategic factor, in your
Oh, yeah.
view, holds the greatest potential to become pivotal and to shift the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine's favor in the medium and long-term perspectives? What, in your opinion, is the key lesson that every modern sovereign democratic state should draw from the experience of Russia's aggression against Ukraine? Thank you, Tatiana. That's truly the question that we're looking at today. Thank you.
Yeah, Tatiana, yeah. Let me answer the second part of that because that relates to the first part. The second part is, the key lesson that modern sovereign democratic states should draw is that collectively they are much less vulnerable than individually. And the thing that the great power of the old liberal democratic order in world politics was this business of collectivity, and it's very difficult to explain quite why that is so strong, but it's the thing that the autocrats have established collective organization like the Warsaw Pact and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but they have never been anything like the collectivity of NATO or the EU or the North American community of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and the Monroe Doctrine states, if you like. I mean, the collectivity of democratic countries is their secret weapon, and it's very hard to break that down. So to create that collectivity is critical. To maintain it is hard, but critical. But that's the single most important thing that any democratic state can do to look after itself in a dangerous world is be part of a genuinely collective organization. Which is why, what's the greatest pivot for the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine, and that lies in Washington. Joe Biden led an extraordinarily strong consensus in 2022, and he made a terrific speech in those first months, saying, this is important to the world. This is about, he said, this is about freedom versus repression, about democracy versus autocracy. He was very clear about all of that. It was a terrific speech. Whatever you think of Joe Biden's, executive abilities, he got it absolutely right, I think, then. And we were genuinely surprised by the degree of consensus. And we all thought this is the way the Western alliance is supposed to work. The United States leads, the Europeans line up behind them, they decide that it's something important, they take economic sanctions. It all seemed to be falling into place. But of course, it was difficult to sustain. Once it became clear that Putin was prepared to fight this war for as long as it took, in his view, once it was clear that he was not going to be, as it were, maneuvered into backing away after defeats in the early months of the war, then the consensus began to fray, and you can see it in specific terms. You look at the desertion rates amongst Ukrainian soldiers now this year since November 2024. They've increased tremendously. And the Ukrainians have got a real problem with desertion rates. I mean, about 300,000 troops have deserted since 2022 or gone
Mm.
AWOL. Now, some of those AWOL people come back. They can be induced to come back. They've been given amnesties and they can be forced back and so on. But I mean, this is from the official Ukrainian sources. I think it's 310,000 troops have deserted technically since the beginning of the war, and that desertion rate has got much higher since Donald Trump was elected, because the sense is that without the United States backing us up, we're not likely to win, or the war is going to go badly for us. And so the internal motivations of a country to fight are driven by the degree of external support. And so they're grateful for what they get from the Europeans, but they don't, Kiev doesn't believe in us the way it believed in Joe Biden's White House in the first 2 years of the war. And that's, if there's one pivotal thing, then I'd say that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for mentioning Biden, a person we never talk about anymore. Let's add to him Tony Blinken, who made some remarkable statements in the UN General Assembly. Very positive and very sadly forgotten. For those who are not native English speakers, AWOL, away without leave, meaning a soldier who has departed without permission.
Yeah. My father went AWOL a couple of times during the Second World War, but he went AWOL just before the Normandy invasion. But he still went into Sword Beach with his mates on the with the South Lancs, the South Lancashire Regiment. So he's still there on Sword Beach with them. But he went AWOL.
Well, Michael,
It happens.
maybe his going AWOL gave us your existence. Maybe you wouldn't have existed.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. And I
Uh,
mean, in Vietnam, I mean, at least
uh,
5% of American forces in Vietnam were deserters or deserted. But
yes, which
it didn't wreck America's military structure in Vietnam.
no,
5% is tolerable. Yeah.
we did lose that war. But
Yeah,
anyway, let's look at two more very intriguing notes here on the side. Nazar Sivak, I believe when Nazar says, I don't agree, that doesn't mean they don't agree with you. They
yeah,
don't
yeah.
agree with Putin, I think. The whole concept of NATO as expanding, this questionable concept.
Oh, yeah.
NATO is not an imperial power. Um,
Yeah.
it's voluntary. The countries that are members are voluntary. And so look, this word expansion implies that it is an imperial power. So that, I think, point well taken, unless you have
Yeah.
other comments on that. Daria Khladka, what is more crucial for ensuring a sustainable peace in Ukraine in the long term? Would it be strengthening that's Ukrainian integration
Yeah.
with NATO and the EU, or focusing primarily on building up our own military capabilities? Great question, Daria, because NATO is not exactly giving the red carpet to Ukrainian membership at this time. She continues, I understand that both dimensions are deeply interconnected, yet many Ukrainian policymakers argue that the country must ultimately rely on its own defense potential. Correct, Michael?
Yes. I mean, Ukraine is not going to come into NATO officially anytime soon for all sorts of reasons that we could talk about, but it isn't. That's the truth of it, because it won't get an Article 5 guarantee as stated in the 1949 Washington Treaty. And the United States at the moment is certainly in no mood to do that, to go along with that. On the other hand, I mean, the Russians are not wrong when they say that Ukraine isn't in NATO, but NATO sure as hell is in Ukraine. And in a way, that's true, because the association with NATO arrangements and, as it were, a functional integration with NATO is well underway, and I think that should continue. And the road to membership of the EU is very important. So it goes back to what I said earlier on, that the best defense for any democratic state is to be part of a collectivity or part of different collective arrangements. And so although being in the EU is entirely feasible, and Putin has said, whether he means it or not, he has said that Russia would not necessarily object to that and would live with that. They certainly wouldn't live with Ukraine coming officially into NATO. But I think to be close to NATO and to have a strong defense in its own right, I think is the way forward. But I have to say, people say, how long will this war last? And I say, well, the antagonism is generational. So you're looking between now and the end of the century. It is going to be a 50 or 60-year antagonism. And that means that Ukraine will have to remain or create and remain heavily armed, porcupine, for the next couple of generations or more. But we can hope that this war, this is the third war, if you think of two in 2014, then 2022 till now, that this may resolve itself into an unstable ceasefire, and perhaps that ceasefire can be made more stable by the political conditions of the time, and that a heavily armed Ukraine, as integrated as feasible to the Western family of nations in Europe, could have a secure and prosperous future, given the inventiveness of the Ukrainian people, the SME sector in Ukraine. The innovation is breathtaking. I mean, driven by war. And it's it's not a young population demographically, but my goodness, it's a resilient population. I have great, if the fighting stops, I have great hopes for Ukraine as a democratic European power.
Mm-hmm.
That I mean, and I go back to people. I say Kiev was founded in the year 482, right? 482. Hundreds of years before Novgorod, hundreds of years before Moscow. I mean, Kiev is the center of the Slavic world of Eastern Europe, and we should respect that. And I look forward to a free and democratic Ukraine with its great Slavic traditions being part of our joint future.
It's very inspiring. Thank you. Um, um, you you tantalized us at the beginning of your talk when you spoke. Oops. Yeah.
Sorry, Dan, I lost the sound then for a moment.
Sorry. Yeah.
You tantalized us, and I
Yes.
lost the next bit.
You certainly want to hear the rest of that, don't you? You mentioned the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is not NATO. It's not the coalition of the. What is it? When was it created, and who's a member?
Yeah. Okay. It was created in 2014. It was an initiative that came out of the summit in Wales at that time, and it was led by Britain. And it was one of these things that politically sounded good, and it didn't require us to do anything. So it was really commended itself to our decision makers. And David Richards, who was the chief of defence staff at the time, he takes a lot of credit, I think justifiably, for the creation of it. But of course, a lot of people now claim to be there at the beginning because it's looking much stronger than it was. So for the first 7 or 8 years of the JEF's existence, it didn't really add up to very much. And who is in it? So it's the Scandinavian. Let's count them off in 10 states. So it's the Scandinavian states. So it's Norway, Sweden, Finland, then Denmark, Netherlands, Britain, and then the 3 Baltic states: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. That's 9, and Iceland. That's the 10th. Right. So 3 Scandinavian states, 3 Baltic states, the northern states, Netherlands, Denmark, and Britain, and then Iceland. Those are your 10. But the thing began to take on real shape just before really the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, and it's taken on a lot of shape since. Now there is no constitution, there is no veto power. It is literally a coalition of the willing on a military basis. So the JEF can, it's not all 10 members might agree to something. 3 of them might do it, all 10 of them might. It's got this flexibility, which both means nothing and everything. And in a way, it means nothing in peacetime, but it could mean everything in times of tension. Because I've always said, we can argue between NATO and the EU about the Berlin Plus formula for using NATO forces and an EU guise. And I always said, all this is rubbish. If it ever came to it, the questions will be really basic. Who has got the forces? Can you get them to the trouble spot? How fast can you get them there? Just get on with it. Who commands it? Okay, who cares? As long as it's a competent commander, he or she, if they can get an army corps up to the Baltics quickly, then do it, and we won't care which rubric it is under. And that, in a way, is the background to the Joint Expeditionary Force. And I think as long as it stays very flexible, it is literally it's the proper version of a coalition of the willing. So it's existed now for over 10 years, and only in the last 3 or 4 years has it looked as if it's got some teeth. But it does have teeth because they now exercise together and they train together and they look at they put the logistics together and they're beginning to procure together now. So, I mean, Britain is building frigates for Norway. We're building frigates for Denmark. We'd never have done that without the JAF because we want to procure common systems, not American stuff. We want to build European stuff because we think that politically it might be more reliable.
Well, who needs NATO? You know, a unity of nations like the European Union and NATO, when it depends on unanimity, that pretty much immobilizes it, doesn't it? A single
It does.
actor like Hungary, for example, could say no, and then it would be no. Now,
That's what they
you're
do. Yeah.
running out
And
of
they have to work
time.
around it. Yeah.
You're running out of time. I need to let Dennis Dimitruk, who created this session, come in with his comment. Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Clarke, and thank you, Professor Wittmann. I just have a short comment to add to the words of Professor Clarke, and maybe a short question, if that's allowed. Professor, you said that Russians kind of like they can't innovate on a tactical level anymore, right? So I don't know if you've heard about this drone unit, Rubicon. Yeah, so that's kind of well, in my opinion, it can be considered like an innovation because it's causing a lot of trouble
Yeah.
for Ukrainian army right now, and that's kind of why the front is moving actually and not just stable. And yeah, one of the questions would be, uh, oh my God, I've got a lot of questions and I need to pop out.
And Professor
Yeah,
Clarke, we'll keep you as long as we can, but when you need to leave, just let us know.
Okay. I'll do about 5 more minutes before I have to.
Okay,
There you
good.
go. Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, do you think that that factor, kind of that Tatiana Mikolajchuk asked before about strategic factor in this war, can this be like long range missiles, long range capability? Because we've heard that Germany, kind of Merz pledged that he would send Ukraine with this long range missiles, and then Trump saying about
Yeah.
oh my God, I forgot the name of this missile, but anyway,
Uh,
Tomahawk.
yeah, Tomahawk,
the
yeah,
tomahawks. Yes, no,
yeah,
yes, no, which is agonizing. Yeah.
and it's kind of like, well, in my opinion, it's something that can change the way this war goes, because when you don't have this long hand, yeah, that you can strike those drone factories and other military targets, like it's never gonna pressure Russia to end this war. So do you see that kind of possible in the near future, or because I mean, that's just my opinion, but Ukrainian capability so far in this regard is not so strong, because we've heard about this Flamingo missile, and it's kind of like we have our doubts about this effectiveness so far. So it's not maybe the game changer right now. So what do you think
Okay.
about it? Yeah.
Yeah, on the first, good points. I mean, on the first point, yeah, of course, soldiers are not stupid, and they find ways on the front line to do things differently and more effectively, and that's what the Russians have found, just as the Ukrainians have. So it isn't that there's no innovation, but the innovation is at a tactical level. Now that tactical level can become part of the operational level, and that can get right up to the strategic level. But it hasn't done that yet. So we've seen innovation at the tactical level, actually on the immediate battlefield, which can make a difference. And it looks as if it's made a difference in Pokrovsk. Now that Pokrovsk is in the foggy season, there's a lot of mist and fog there, which makes it easier for Russian battlefield tactics to work, which they seem to have done so far. So that always happens. But what I'm saying is that the Russians are not capable at the moment of any strategic innovation, because they're sending everybody straight to the battlefront, where they can only do more of the same. They have to hold forces back and retrain them to do something differently. Now, there's some evidence they may be doing that for next year, but we'll see how big their reserve forces are. And the Ukrainians don't have enough men and women to be able to do that. That's one of their problems. They just don't have the weight of forces to go into reserve and retrain to do something different. We'll see. And on the deep strike, as it is, the long range weapons, you're talking about the German Taurus missiles, which the Germans still won't give, and Tomahawk missiles, which the United States has implied, as Dan said. I mean, yes, no, yes, no. In a way, that may become less relevant next year because the Ukrainians have got their FP5, the Flamingo, and the Flamingo is just as long range as a Tomahawk. It's not as accurate, but the Flamingo is home produced. It's an extremely good system. It only was unveiled about a month ago, and some of the solid rocket fuel for that is being produced in Denmark, interestingly. And so Kiev is on the point of producing its own weapon systems. It's less dependent on the West than it used to be. So at the moment, about only 20% of its weapons are American, but they're the best 20%. They're the 20% it really wants. About 40% are from European sources, and the other 40% is producing itself. And within about a year, Ukraine will probably be producing about 60% of its own weapons, including deep strike weapons. So Flamingo is a missile, but they've also got deep strike drones. So the Flamingos are the FP5, but their FP1s and FP2s are capable of reaching deep inside Russia, as they have done in all sorts of clever ways. And you bet your life that when they can get enough Flamingos together, they only started producing them about 2 months ago. When they can get enough together, they'll do exactly as you say. They'll go after the factory in Alabuga in Tatarstan, where the Russians are making all of their Shahid drones in huge numbers. A lot of African women are working in the Tatarstan factory, and reputedly North Koreans on contract. And so they'll go after places. They have hit Alabuga, but they'll hit it in big ways once they can. So yeah, long range artillery, as you might call it, rocket artillery, is something the Ukrainians are getting on top of now, even as the Russians use their own. So there's more equality in that battle space than there was about a year ago.
And when President Zelensky says NATO needs us more than we need them, there is some truth to that. Ukrainian innovation and recent conflict experience puts it way ahead, I think, and even in Western Europe in terms of recent experience that's relevant to the challenges we have. Gleb Belyanovsky has been very eager to get in some comments and question. Do you have another couple of minutes?
Yeah,
Michael,
go on. I can do one more. Then
okay.
I must go.
This is Gleb. Do you want to unmute, Gleb?
Yes, thank you so much, because I
Yeah.
really wanted to ask you very briefly. We are running out of time, so I'll ask briefly. Talking about, in general, perspectives, as you split them in 3 groups, of the United States, of Russia, of the European Union, I wanted to discuss and get to know about your point of view of, in general, American perspective, because we know that Soviet Union, it made Americans before the Reagan to make a conclusion that there is no way to achieve a victory because these are post-nuclear states. So the only way to deal with Soviet Union is to coexist. This idea was in the minds of majority of the Americans until the Reagan came in power and he told that no, we need to destroy this evil empire. And my question is, how different is in general American perspective on European security and of course East European security, in terms of that America is the biggest supplier of the weapons, both for Middle East, both for Ukraine, both for Europe, let's say. And is the United States really a state which is interested to destroy the bandit who is Russia and who is Iran, when we understand that after that, Saudi Arabia and Europe will not be such an active purchaser of American weapon industry complex? That's my question.
Okay. I know what you mean. I mean, before the Trump administration, I think the United States had every intention of just managing the relationship with Russia and living in a state of peaceful coexistence, which does always benefit us more than them, or it has done in the past. And President Obama, of course, upset Russia when he said that Russia was just a regional power. They hated that idea that they'd be regarded only as a regional power. But I don't think Donald Trump has any intention at all of wanting to destroy Russia. He may want regime change in Iran, and he certainly wants regime change in Venezuela, and he wouldn't mind quite a bit of regime change one way or another across Europe. But he has no ambitions to destroy Russia. I think President Trump sees the world in terms of big figures like himself. So he sees a world of United States, Russia, and China being able to organize a spheres of influence approach to global politics. And that is free of any ideology about liberal democracy or whatever. He sees great power politics in a very straightforward sort of way. So I don't think there's any sense that he's not. He likes Reagan a lot, but I don't think he imitates Reagan's desire to somehow end the Russian regime.
And the ominous aspect of that is if the three great powers were granted regional hegemony, the U.S. would get the Western Hemisphere, Russia would get Europe, and China would get the rest. This is a very ominous thought.
Absolutely, and he's working towards that already. Yeah.
Yes, and some of us would like to see regime change in Washington, D.C. I'm going to edit that out of the Michael Clarke, thank you so much for giving it to us straight. None of this is pleasant. There
No.
are elements of optimism, but there's a lot. We must see with clear eyes what's coming. It's not going to be easy. We have tremendous admiration for the Ukrainian people, for their innovation. And we all wish them the best. We wish the Germans would send what they promised and the Americans. But given that they're not doing that, Ukraine is taking its own destiny into its own hands. We can only admire them for that.
We can.
Michael
we can
Clarke,
hope for anything we like, but hope is not a strategy. You can only strategize on what you see in front of you. You can hope for anything, but it's no strategy.
thank you for that marvelous reminder. Thank you, Michael Clarke.
Pleasure.
If others can stay on for 10 minutes, I'd like to share a video with you. And I think I have to mute everybody once again. There is, let's see. Oh, yeah, sorry, everybody. There's somebody was unmuted. Now, let me, in the interest of setting up the Monday session, thank you, Gleb and Dennis and others. This was a remarkable discussion. I took lots of notes. Michael Clarke has enormous wisdom and I think common sense. And I think common sense is what we need a lot of. Gleb, while I'm setting up a video I'd like to share, Gleb, you have a comment?
Yes, Mr. Dan Bittman, it will be personally for you because probably Mr. Clarke, he didn't understand my question properly. My question was if I must say that obviously the whole activity of Trump, it can be motivated in many different ways. So obviously what Mr. Clarke told about his intentions in this administration towards this war, it's like that. My question was a bit deeper about the general, I would say, strategy of the United States, because this conflict between United States and Europe, that Europe doesn't invest in its own security, it's a very long story. I mean, President Eisenhower, he was already very angry at his times on Europe, that Europe isn't responsible for its own security, and that the United States have to send all the dotations for that. My question was, is United States really interested in having a good security in Europe, eliminating the bandit Russia, eliminating the bandit Iran, if they understand that their main allies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia nowadays, and main allies at the European Union, won't be purchasing their military production if these bandits like Iran and Russia won't exist anymore as a threat. So my question for you, if it is a more broader context and more deeper strategy for the, let's say, Department of State or, I don't know, White House.
I'm laughing, Gleb, because the White House does not have a strategy. The State Department does not have a strategy. Clearly, our strategic mechanism in Washington is at the moment completely broken. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I've been attending meetings from the very highest leaders of so-called policy, for example, on Africa. There's no policy. In Washington, many of us are just simply waiting until some positive change takes place. As we are now, as I said at the beginning, when I say we're an unreliable ally, I don't mean we're bad. I should say we're an unpredictable ally. I think we're in a very dark place right now. There's no getting around it. President Trump 6 years ago said Article 5, no. Now he says Article 5, yes. How can one possibly construct a strategy or even a policy around this? Gleb, I invite you to take up this question. It's a very important and painful question. Let's take this up at a future session when we may have the adequate time to do it justice, if you agree to that. And I would ask, maybe you would lead a discussion on that topic because it's very vital, very important. I think at this point we can only say the United States, which used to be the indispensable nation, is being unpredictable. I guess I won't say unreliable, unpredictable. How can one construct a policy or a strategy? I think Ukraine not only absolutely had to develop its own military resources, but it's amazing how they have been able to do so. Ukraine is now exporting drones. They're exporting. That's amazing in the middle of a conflict. Let me, Gleb, that's it. I haven't answered your question at all. I think we should have a bit of a session in the future, and I would ask that you lead that session. That this is important stuff.
Okay.
Now,
Mr.
let-
Whitman, one more minute. I would just want to add one point to what you say about the Ukrainian army itself. You're absolutely right. And as you know, probably from my past, that I used to work in the President Zelensky's party. And on that topic, I had a cooperation with Danish Conservative Party and some other party in the parliament. And what you say is that United States at this point became, in the eyes of the partners, such an unreliable partner that Denmark is very seriously thinking how it should protect its own borders in Greenland if all the weapons which they buy is American one and which can be switched off by some buttons in the Washington DC. So you're absolutely right about that. Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Offline, I will tell you an anecdote of how I personally disrupted a policy meeting in which their discussion was, shall we take Greenland? And I disrupted the meeting because I served in Denmark. I've been to Greenland, and this idea of taking Greenland is just simply absurd. I'm not sure it was ever a serious question. Some people in the Heritage Foundation, and I've met them, actually believe that this should happen. These people are crazy. And I can talk more about that in another session. I want to set up the Monday session. Monday, Robert Fry is going to join us. Robert Fry retired from ABC News, was the producer for Peter Jennings. So when we used to have network news in the United States, we didn't have internet and cable and all this. The American exposure to news was more pure in a way. We had ABC, NBC, CBS. That was it. We had three networks. Robert Fry was the producer of in ABC Peter Jennings' nightly news, and he has an enormous experience and wisdom on what it was in previous times to run a news program. And he's going to talk to us about that on Monday. Since retirement, he has devoted himself to bringing to the world's attention, and especially to young people, the problem we never talk about, but it never goes away, which is nuclear weapons. He's made a series, and this is now what he's doing full time. He's a marvelous person. I want to play you just a trailer. It's just 4 minutes long of his first documentary film on this topic called In My Lifetime. And please interrupt me if the audio does not come through. I just want you to see this trailer as a sample of what Robert Fry does. He will be our guest on Monday. Are you getting the audio? I hope.
the delegates please rise? Members of the General Assembly,
I feel impelled to speak today in a language that, in a sense, is new. One which I, who have spent so much of my life in the military profession, would have preferred never to use. That new language is the language of atomic warfare. The atomic age has moved forward at such a pace that every citizen of the world should have some comprehension, at least in comparative terms, of the extent of this development, of the utmost significance to every one of us.
And Archimedes, in explaining the principles of the lever, was said to have declared to his friends, "Give me a place where I can stand, and I shall move the world." My fellow inhabitants of this planet, let us take our stand here in this assembly of nations, and let us see that if we, in our own time, can move the world to a just and lasting peace.
At 1500 hours on October 16, 1964, the event which shocked the whole world finally takes place. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is now ready to be signed.
We have come here today to the East Room of the White House to sign a treaty which limits the spread of nuclear weapons. More than 55 nations are here in Washington this morning to commit their governments to this treaty. Their representatives are also signing today in Moscow and London. We hope and expect that virtually all the nations will move in the weeks and months ahead to accept this treaty, which was commended to the world by the overwhelming majority of the members of the United Nations General Assembly.
Those who had nuclear weapons at the time, there were 5 at that time: the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, China, and France. They committed themselves in clear terms that they are going to move away from nuclear weapons, abolish nuclear weapons.
I know the stubborn patience, persistence that it has required to come this far. And we do not underestimate the difficulties that may lie ahead.
In 1970, we committed ourselves to establish a world free from nuclear weapons. That was the commitment under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Okay, thank you for bearing with me. I just wanted you to see a little sample of Robert Fry's work. His work is non-judgmental. It pretty much in the spirit of Michael Clarke. He basically shows us, well, here's what we've got. It's a very enormous challenge. You've heard about the nuclear clock. We're like 2 minutes to midnight in terms of the peril that we all live in. I'm going to send to everybody 2 things before Monday. First of all, an article recently published by Serhiy Plokhy. The Ukrainians will recognize Serhiy Plokhy as the Harvard professor of Ukrainian history. And in his article a couple of days ago, he talks about how do we deal with Putin's threats to use tactical nuclear weapons. And I will leave you in suspense about how he concludes this. I think it's vital. It's not just a matter of being terrified and being afraid of getting out of bed. It's a matter of understanding where are we in the world with nuclear weapons, which are never going to be removed, I think, and which stand as a threat. What is the proper response on the part of Ukraine and its friends when it listens to Putin threaten to use these weapons? Robert Fry is a wonderful teacher. He's going to ask for your participation, by the way, and I ask that you meet his challenge. He's going to say, "I want to hear from you." Again, ABC News producer, retired relatively early, and is now devoting his life to bringing to the attention of young people in the entire world where do we stand with respect to nuclear weapons. So I leave you with that. Gleb, I think we have an agreement. At some point, we will discuss further the question you came up. And I think for today, we'll say goodbye. I'm very grateful to Dennis and to Michael Clarke. I think this was a very clear and lucid picture of what we've got. As he said, or as military doctrine says, we must deal with the world we have, not the one that we wish we had. And we'll leave on that note. I'll be sending you some links to Robert Fry's videos. They're long, they're very long. So I'll leave it up to you whether you want to view them, but I will give you access to his 3 documentaries, and then we'll meet him on Monday. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.